If you don't want to feel left out at brunch, you've probably watched the most recent season of the hit Netflix sci-fi comedy musical Stranger Things. And while the show's things are definitely getting stranger, they're also getting realer? By referencing the real-life concerns that Dungeons & Dragons and heavy metal music inspired a number of ritualistic murders in the 1980s. And while there may not have been demogorgons, the real story is quite surprising.
The role-playing tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, has long been at the center of accusations surrounding Satanism. The game debuted in 1974 and features elements of magic in a creative, fictional way, playing as wizards and warlocks, encountering monsters and demons. Beyond this, the game also requires meeting objectives through battling, which some argue married the occult with murder and violence.
In 1980, the game garnered national attention as being the culprit for the fate of James Dallas Egbert III, a young 16-year-old college student and regular D&D player at Michigan State University.
Egbert disappeared from his dorm room in 1979 only to be found a month later. Some accused the game of causing him to act erratically and alter his mindset. Many then doubled down on the fact that Egbert died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound less than a year after he was found. Looking past the game, many claim he was already dealing with mental health struggles that predated his involvement in D&D. In 1982, a teenager and D&D enthusiast named Irving Lee Pulling II died by suicide. His mother pointed the finger at both D&D and his D&D group, which had named themselves Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. Only 2 years later, in 1984, the murder of 18-year-old Mary C. Towie was also connected back to the game. The two convicted killers in her case, Ronald G. Adcox and Darren Lee Molitor, did play Dungeons & Dragons. During Molitor's trial, he actually brought D&D into the explanation for what he and Adcox did, saying, "The reason I brought the game into the defense was not the evil aspect of it, but the way the game is played, the mind use." He also stated, "There is proof and evidence, in fact, that anything done within that aspect of role-playing is effective and is dangerous." Molitor later claimed that he and Adcox had not initially intended to kill Towie, who was bound and had an athletic bandage wrapped around her throat. Instead, he claimed that they just wanted to play, quote, mind games. Towie died from this strangulation.
But the fervor didn't focus solely on Dungeons & Dragons for long, and eventually moved on to blame heavy metal rock music as well.
In 1984, Ricky Kasso allegedly murdered his 17-year-old friend, Gary Lauwers, in Newport, New York. Though investigations suggested that the murder was motivated by drugs, Lauwers supposedly stole drugs from Kasso during a party, some tried to connect the case to Satanism. Kasso died before his trial and killed himself in his cell, but some of his friends claim Kasso had bragged about killing his friend. Many alleged his friend group, who dubbed themselves the Knights of the Black Circle, were a satanic cult. His friends denied these claims, but acknowledged the drug use and dealing that Kasso was participating in. Some even called him, quote, the Acid King. In Rolling Stone's story on Kasso, in which teens and adults who knew Ricky or were relatively in similar social circles provided interviews and statements, music was mentioned numerous times, such as Black Sabbath, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, and Billy Idol, among others. When newsworthy cases concerning Satanist allegations made headlines, any direct or indirect connection to metal music was made known, particularly in allegations of murder. Lyrics, both what was literally written and what many claimed were hidden on tracks, fueled the theory that rock and metal music was indoctrinating children and teens into Satanism. The content of many rock and metal bands at the time pushed the envelope by the standards of the previous generation, fueling already existing anxieties about the ways society was changing. Prior to the death of Lauwers, Kasso had been arrested for digging up a gravesite, which conspiracy theorists tried to use as evidence for his involvement in satanic rituals.
But soon, ties to D&D and metal music weren't even necessary to accuse someone of practicing Satanism. It seemed that just about any major heinous crime could be tied to Satanism, and often allegations of ties to Satan were used to prove guilt.
During the summer of 1983, a mother from Manhattan Beach, California, accused an employee of McMartin Preschool of abusing her son. Police intervened by sending home letters to every parent. The letter went on to describe examples of sexual abuse, instructing parents as to what to ask their children. Police also involved therapists and tasked them with interviewing the preschoolers. The young children were interviewed for hours on end, being asked leading questions by today's standards. Some potentially concerning claims came from these interviews, but nothing that pointed to Satanism at first. In 1986, 7 other employees at the McMartin Preschool were charged with over 100 counts of child molestation and conspiracy. All 7 claimed innocence from the start. Within a week, charges against 5 of the employees had been dropped for, quote, weak evidence. Trials went on for years and became a massive public display. As time went on, claims against the school grew more colorful and aligned with Satanism. Some of these included animal sacrifices, violent acts, and a, quote, goat man. Others referenced rituals that took place at cemeteries and utilized tunnels beneath the school. The initial McMartin case came to an end in 1990. The accused were acquitted of some charges and the jury was hung on the others. A second trial was organized for the hung verdicts, but ended in a mistrial. After this, the charges were eventually dropped. In the 1990s, 3 teenagers who would later be known as the West Memphis Three, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., were arrested and found guilty of charges related to a, quote, satanic ritual for which they served nearly 20 years. The case involved the deaths of 3 young boys, all 8 years old, who were found murdered near West Memphis, Arkansas. Despite no physical evidence of Eccles or his friends being present near the murders, they were found guilty anyway. What influenced both the jury's and the public's perception of the 3 was, primarily, their interest in heavy metal music and the occult. Eccles maintained that they knew nothing about the children who were found dead, but that he did have an interest in Wicca, metal music, and other things that fed into the narrative of Satanism at the time. The 3 teens were originally found guilty and given life sentences in 1996. They would stay in prison until 2011. With new DNA evidence pointing to their innocence, a new deal was arranged. It allowed them to publicly proclaim their innocence and leave prison, but technically remain guilty on the books. The creators of Stranger Things have mentioned that Eccles was one of the influences for the character of Eddie Munson, the hard-rocking dungeon master who was falsely accused of satanic crimes in Season 4.
The 1980s and 90s saw much more of the Satanic Panic, with almost 200 people being charged with crimes related to Satanism. Of those accused, dozens ended up serving jail time after being found guilty. With time, we can come to understand the flurry of accusations as being less indicative of actual satanic activity and more so a sign of the times.
Danny Davis, who served as the attorney for one of the accused preschool teachers, believed the entire phenomenon was an example of, quote, social contagion. In preparation to defend his client, he researched similar phenomena in history, like witch hunts, and spoke to his findings. I saw clearly there's a process on a timeline that starts with some sort of scandal or change in the society that develops a very forceful, agreed-upon accusation against a target or scapegoat, and the scapegoat is then quickly destroyed. In 2005, a former McMartin student publicly recanted his claims and apologized for the accusations via an interview with the Los Angeles Times. He stated that he was never convinced of any false memories and always knew his contributions to the police were fabricated. He spoke about the long and stressful interview process, remembering that he thought, quote, "I'm not going to get out of here unless I tell them what they want to hear." Much of the fervor for the Satanic Panic was carried through by the religious right. Some believe it was born from the concern about what was thought to be traditional family values disappearing and what negative outcomes that may have. The initial fear was fueled by police, social workers, and even the FBI. It later became a campaign furthered by politicians and the media.
But D&D wasn't the first scapegoat, and it won't be the last. Today, one could easily find large groups rallying around modern claims of satanic ritual abuse. Awful and horrific acts of evil do happen far too often, regardless of how civilized we think we might be as a society. But it might be worth considering that blaming Satanism, ritualistic cults, music, and games might just be preventing us from looking at ourselves and taking ownership for our own failings.